Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the verbatim federal courtroom testimony of the Sean Diddy Combs trial as reported by credible sources who were present during the proceedings. What happens when the person defending you can no longer stand by your side? When the evidence is so damning that even your most loyal advocate walks away. That's exactly what happened 1 minute ago when Howard Stern, Diddy's high-profile defense attorney, dramatically quit in the middle of the trial after hearing an audio recording that left him visibly shaken and unable to continue representation. Nobody expected the lead attorney to abandon ship. The room was tense, eyes focused on Stern as he listened to the recording through headphones provided by the prosecution. Gasps echoed. Even the judge froze. No announcement, no pre-written statement, just Stern ripping off the headphones, his face draining of color as he stood abruptly, gathering his papers with trembling hands. Until that moment, Stern had been Diddy's fiercest defender throughout the trial, but something had changed. Maybe it was hearing something that contradicted everything his client had told him. Maybe it was realizing he had been manipulated into defending the indefensible. Maybe it was recognizing that his own professional reputation was about to be irreparably damaged. Whatever it was, Stern was done pretending. He wasn't there as a celebrity attorney anymore. He was there as a legal professional whose ethical boundaries had been catastrophically breached. And when he approached the bench to speak privately with the judge, the courtroom wasn't prepared for what they would witness. Because what that audio recording contained about Diddy's actions, his knowledge of crimes, and his willingness to obstruct justice wasn't just explosive. It was a career ender for both client and attorney. If you're finding this story compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more breaking news and in-depth coverage of high-profile cases like this one. I'm standing in front of the federal courthouse where one of the most shocking moments in legal history has just unfolded. The air is charged with tension, reporters frantically filing updates, and legal experts gathered in small clusters trying to make sense of what just happened inside. It started like any other day of the trial. The room buzzed with low conversations. The press hunched in their designated rows, and Diddy sat beside his high-powered legal team led by Howard Stern, the renowned defense attorney whose client list reads like a who's who of celebrities who've escaped serious legal consequences. But when prosecutor Samantha Reynolds announced they would be presenting a newly discovered audio recording, the room changed. You could hear a pin drop. Some people thought it was just another piece of evidence. Others expected standard procedural objections. But the way Stern suddenly straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing as the prosecution approached the bench, told everyone this was different. The judge raised an eyebrow, and Stern, who'd been projecting confident control throughout the proceedings, suddenly looked alert and concerned. Stern leaned forward, whispering urgently to Diddy, who shrugged, dismissively as if whatever was coming couldn't possibly matter. Stern's posture stiffened, his experienced legal instincts clearly sensing danger. Your Honor, the prosecution has just received evidence item 147-2C, an audio recording recovered from a device belonging to Mr. Combs's former security chief, Reynolds began. Given the sensitive nature of this recording, we request that it initially be reviewed privately by the court and both counsels before determining its admissibility. The judge allowed it, and from that moment on, the entire trial shifted because what that recording contained wasn't part of any media narrative. It wasn't speculation or hearsay. It was Diddy's own voice saying things that would shatter his defense strategy completely. As the judge called a brief recess to review the recording, in chambers with both attorneys, Diddy remained at the defense table, scrolling through his phone, seemingly unconcerned. It would be the last moment of composure he would display that day. 20 minutes later, when the doors to the judge's chambers opened, Howard Stern emerged first. His face had lost all color. His hands were visibly shaking. Behind him, the prosecutor walked with the confident stride of someone who knew the case had just been irrevocably altered. The judge took her seat and called the court to order. Before she could speak, Stern approached the bench, requesting permission to address the court on an urgent matter. Outside the courtroom, fans and curious onlookers gathered, unaware that inside, one of the most dramatic attorney withdrawals in legal history was about to unfold. As Stern stood to address the courtroom collectively held its breath. No one was prepared for what came next. To understand the magnitude of Stern's decision, you need to understand his position in the legal world. Howard Stern wasn't just any attorney. He was the go-to lawyer for celebrities in serious trouble. For 3 decades, he had built a reputation as the ultimate legal fixer, the attorney who could get seemingly impossible results for clients facing overwhelming evidence. His relationship with Diddy stretched back 15 years through various legal entanglements that had always ended favorably for the music mogul. Stern's defense strategies were legendary, aggressive, meticulous, and always effective. His decision to represent Diddy in this current case had been seen as a major advantage for the defense. From the beginning of the trial, Stern had projected absolute confidence. His opening statement had been masterful, painting Diddy as a successful businessman targeted by jealous competitors and disgruntled former associates. He systematically challenged prosecution witnesses, finding inconsistencies and creating reasonable doubt. Legal analysts had repeatedly praised his performance, with many suggesting that despite the serious charges, Stern might once again work his legal magic. Behind the scenes, however, tensions had been building. Sources close to the defense team later revealed that Stern had repeatedly pressed Diddy for complete transparency about potential evidence, emphasizing that he could only build an effective defense if he wasn't blindsided in court. "I don't care what you did," Stern had reportedly told Diddy in private meetings. "I care what they can prove you did, and I can't defend against what I don't know about." Diddy had consistently assured his attorney that everything had been disclosed, that there were no more surprises waiting. These assurances had become increasingly emphatic as the trial progressed and the prosecution presented its case. The week before the bombshell recording emerged, Stern had scored significant victories for the defense. He had successfully challenged the credibility of 2 key prosecution witnesses and gotten portions of physical evidence excluded on technical grounds. The momentum seemed to be shifting in Diddy's favor. Then came the morning when everything changed. The prosecution had been unusually tight-lipped about their next moves, with Reynolds simply indicating they would be presenting additional evidence when court resumed. When the recording was announced, initial reactions were mixed. The defense team seemed more irritated than concerned about this last-minute evidence. During the morning break, Stern was observed discussing strategy with his associates, his demeanor still confident and controlled. No one, not the press, not the spectators, not even Diddy himself, appeared to realize that this recording would derail not just the day's proceedings, but the entire defense strategy and professional relationship between the high-profile attorney and his notorious client. As Stern, Reynolds, and the judge retired to chambers to review the recording, the courtroom remained oblivious to the bombshell about to detonate. Journalists speculated about what the recording might contain. Perhaps more evidence of financial improprieties or testimony from a new witness. The 20 minutes that Stern spent in chambers listening to that recording would prove to be the breaking point. The moment when one of the country's most effective defense attorneys would determine that there are lines even he wouldn't cross. When Stern returned to the courtroom, those who knew him well immediately recognized something. was wrong. His typically commanding presence had diminished. The confident stride was gone, replaced by the careful movements of a man who had just had the foundation beneath his feet torn away. As he approached the bench to request permission to address the court, the shift in his demeanor was so pronounced that reporters began frantically texting their editors that something unprecedented was unfolding. What no one knew yet was that the recording Stern had just heard contradicted specific statements Diddy had made directly to him. Statements that had formed the cornerstone of the defense strategy. Worse, the recording suggested that Diddy had deliberately misled his own attorney, placing Stern in a position that threatened not just this case, but his entire legal career. Your Honor, I need to address the court on an urgent matter of professional ethics, Stern began, his voice noticeably strained. The typically eloquent attorney seemed to be choosing each word with painful deliberation. The judge, sensing the gravity of the moment, instructed the jury to be temporarily excused. Once they had filed out, she turned back to Stern. Proceed, counselor. As Wright took the stand, Diddy's former head of security now turned state's witness. The full extent of the control system became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about individual instances of misconduct. It was about a methodical, long-term strategy to maintain power through intimidation, surveillance, and leverage. And at the center of it all sat Diddy, now watching as the carefully constructed layers of protection he had described in the recording were stripped away one by one. Jason Wright settled into the witness stand, a stark contrast to the imposing security chief he had once been. Now, wearing a simple suit rather than his customary black tactical attire, he looked smaller, almost diminished. But his testimony would prove to be anything but inconsequential. Reynolds approached him. Mr. Wright, can you explain your former position with Mr. Combs? I was head of personal security for Mr. Combs from 2016 until 4 months ago, Wright replied. I coordinated his protection team, oversaw security at his properties, and handled what he called special projects. And what did these special projects entail? Reynolds asked. Wright took a deep breath. They included surveillance of individuals Mr. Combs considered potential threats, collecting compromising information on business associates and artists, and ensuring certain activities remained private. Reynolds nodded. Let's discuss the recording. We just heard. Why did you make this recording? Insurance, Wright stated simply. I'd been involved in activities that I knew crossed legal lines. As time went on, the requests became more extreme. I started documenting conversations to protect myself. When you say more extreme, can you elaborate? Reynolds asked. Wright looked directly at Diddy for the first time. It started with basic surveillance, watching certain artists to make sure they weren't meeting with competing labels or talking to journalists. Then it escalated to installing recording devices in guest suites at Mr. Combs's properties. Eventually, it included coordinating what Mr. Combs called leverage events, parties designed specifically to capture people in compromising situations. Reynolds approached with a document. This is a floor plan of Mr. Combs's Miami residence. Can you indicate where recording equipment was installed? Wright marked several locations on the displayed diagram. Hidden cameras and microphones were in all guest bedrooms, the pool area, the main living room, and the studio. The feeds went to a secure server that only Mr. Combs and I had access to. And what was the purpose of this surveillance? Reynolds asked. Mr. Combs called it collecting insurance. He would review the footage after events, flagging anything that could be used as leverage in business dealings or to ensure someone's silence about his activities, Wright explained. Reynolds continued, in the recording we heard, Mr. Combs mentioned the system. Can you explain what that referred to? Wright nodded. The system was what Mr. Combs called his overall approach to maintaining control. It had several components: financial control through contracts, social influence through his industry position, and what he called personal leverage, compromising, information that could be used when necessary. As Wright continued his testimony, he detailed how the system operated. Young artists would be invited to parties or recording sessions where they were encouraged to let their guard down. Drinks would flow freely, often spiked with additional substances without their knowledge. Conversations were steered toward damaging admissions or controversial topics, all of it captured for potential future use. What happened if someone threatened to speak out about these activities? Reynolds asked. Wright's expression darkened. There was a protocol. First, a reminder about NDAs and legal consequences. If that didn't work, they'd receive evidence that we had compromising material, just a screenshot or short clip so they knew it existed. If they still persisted, more direct pressure was applied. What form did this direct pressure take? Reynolds pressed. It varied. Sometimes financial. Suddenly, their projects would lose funding, or radio stations would stop playing their music. Sometimes personal. Information about affairs or substance use would find its way to tabloids. Sometimes it escalated to threats against their reputation or career. Wright testified. Reynolds approached with another exhibit. This document was recovered from Mr. Combs's office. Can you identify it? Wright examined the paper. This is what we called the problem sheet, a list of individuals who had become concerns, with notes about their vulnerabilities and the leverage we had on each of them. The document contained dozens of names, artists, executives, even journalists, each with notations about pressure points and available material. Reynolds turned back to the witness. Mr. Wright, what prompted you to eventually cooperate with investigators? This question seemed to hit Wright differently. He took a moment before responding, his composure slipping slightly. There was an incident last year involving a young female artist. She had complained about contract terms and was considering legal action. Mr. Combs instructed me to remind her of Miami, referring to footage from a party at his Miami home. When I showed her the selected clips as instructed, she became hysterical, saying she had no memory of those events, that she had only had 2 drinks that night. Wright paused, visibly uncomfortable. It became clear to me that her drinks had been tampered with specifically to create this leverage. She was devastated. A week later, she signed the revised contract. 2 weeks after that, she was hospitalized for a suicide attempt. The courtroom was completely silent as Wright continued. That was my breaking point. I had told myself this was all just business, just how the industry worked. But seeing what it did to her, someone who was barely 22, years old with her whole career ahead of her, I couldn't keep lying to myself. Reynolds asked gently, "What did you do then?" I started gathering evidence, copying files, recording conversations like the one you just heard. I knew that once I left, Mr. Combs would deploy the same system against me. I needed protection, Wright explained. And did Mr. Combs attempt to use this system against you when you left his employment? Reynolds asked. Wright nodded grimly. Within 2 days of my resignation, compromising photos of me appeared online. My wife received an anonymous email with video of me with another woman, a video taken at one of Mr. Combs's properties years ago. My teenage daughter's social media was hacked. The message was clear. Yet you still chose to cooperate with authorities, Reynolds noted. I did, Wright confirmed, because I realized the system only works when people stay afraid. And I was tired of being afraid. At the defense table, Diddy's new attorney was frantically writing notes, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his client. But Diddy himself sat unnaturally still, his expression frozen in a mask of indifference that seemed increasingly difficult to maintain. Reynolds approached with one final exhibit. "Mr. Wright, I'm showing you what has been marked as evidence item 147D. Can you identify this?" Wright examined the document. "This is a list of attorneys, judges, and law enforcement officials. The notations indicate which ones were friendly, meaning they could be counted on to help if legal issues arose." "And how were these friendly relationships maintained?" Reynolds asked. "Some through legitimate social connections, others through more problematic means, financial arrangements through consulting contracts, compromising information held as leverage, or benefits provided to family members," Wright testified. He pointed to a name on the list. "This notation, here, Miami yacht footage, refers to recording of this individual engaging in illegal activity during an event on Mr. Combs's yacht. That recording was insurance to ensure their cooperation if needed." Reynolds looked toward the defense table. "Was Howard Stern on this list?" "No," Wright replied firmly. "Mr. Stern was not among the attorneys Mr. Combs claimed to have leverage over. Mr. Combs often said Stern was too big to compromise and too valuable to risk exposing to the system." The implication was clear. Stern had been kept in the dark about the full extent of Diddy's activities, which explained his dramatic withdrawal upon hearing the recording. He had been defending his client based on a carefully curated version of events that the recording had shattered. As Wright's testimony continued, the full scope of the system became increasingly clear. Not random acts of intimidation or occasional ethical lapses, but a sophisticated, long-running operation designed to maintain control through fear, leverage, and strategic deployment of compromising material. And for the first time since the trial began, Diddy's carefully maintained facade began to visibly crack. The control he had exercised for so long was slipping away, exposed by someone who had once been integral to maintaining it. After a brief recess, court resumed with the defense's cross-examination of Jason Wright. Bennett, Diddy's new attorney, approached the witness with carefully controlled aggression. "Mr. Wright, you've testified about this supposed system of control and intimidation. Yet you were a willing participant in these activities for years, correct?" Bennett began. Wright nodded. "Yes, I was." "And you only decided to record conversations and gather evidence when you feared for your own position?" Bennett pressed. "I made choices I'm not proud of," Wright acknowledged. "But yes, self-preservation was initially my motivation." Bennett paced before the witness stand. "You've been granted immunity for your testimony, haven't you? Immunity for activities that, by your own admission, included illegal surveillance, blackmail, and witness intimidation?" "Limited immunity. Yes," Wright confirmed. "So your testimony here could be viewed as simply saving yourself at Mr. Combs's expense?" Bennett suggested. Wright met his gaze directly. "I understand how it might look that way, but the recording speaks for itself. Those aren't my words planning these activities." Bennett shifted tactics. "Let's discuss the recording. You made it, secretly, without Mr. Combs's knowledge or consent?" "Yes," Wright confirmed. "And you did so in a private residence, potentially violating federal and state wiretapping laws." Bennett continued. "My understanding from prosecutors is that Florida is a two-party consent state for recordings, but there are exceptions when recording evidence of a crime," Wright responded. Bennett approached with a document. "Are you aware that you signed this confidentiality agreement when you began working for Mr. Combs? An agreement that specifically prohibited any recording of conversations?" "I was aware," Wright acknowledged. Bennett seemed to gain confidence. "So not only did you potentially violate wiretapping laws, but you also violated a binding legal agreement. Why should the jury believe testimony from someone who so readily breaks legal obligations? Wright paused before responding. Because I reached a point where I believed my legal obligation to not participate in criminal activity outweighed my contractual obligation to keep secrets. The response seemed to resonate with several jurors, who nodded slightly. Bennett changed direction. You've testified about surveillance equipment in Mr. Combs's properties. Isn't it standard practice for high-profile individuals to have comprehensive security systems? Security cameras in public areas of a property are standard, Wright clarified. Hidden cameras in guest bedrooms activated during private parties are not. Bennett's frustration became visible. You've made serious allegations about the purpose of these recordings, but isn't it possible they were for Mr. Combs's own protection? Celebrities are often targets for false accusations. If that were the case, Wright replied calmly, the footage would be stored securely as evidence of consensual interactions. It wouldn't be organized in files labeled leverage and referenced in conversations about forcing people to comply with demands. Each attempt by Bennett to discredit Wright seemed to backfire, with the former security chief providing measured, specific responses that only reinforced his credibility. Bennett made one final attempt. Mr. Wright, you've painted a picture of Mr. Combs as the architect of this supposed system. But isn't it true that many of these activities were initiated by you and other staff members without Mr. Combs's direct knowledge? Wright shook his head. No. As you heard in the recording, Mr. Combs referred to the system as something he created and directed. He gave specific instructions about surveillance targets, reviewed the gathered material personally, and directed how it should be used. Bennett returned to the defense table, conferring briefly with Diddy. The music mogul's composure had continued to deteriorate throughout the cross-examination, his legendary confidence now replaced with visible tension. The prosecutor rose for redirect examination. Mr. Wright, one final question. Based on your years working directly with Mr. Combs, was there any aspect of this operation, the surveillance, the leverage, the pressure tactics, that happened without his knowledge or approval? Wright's answer was unequivocal. No, nothing significant happened without his knowledge. Mr. Combs often said, "Nothing happens in my world that I don't control." And he meant it. As Wright was dismissed from the stand, the prosecutor called their next witness, the digital forensics expert who had analyzed the recordings and electronic evidence. With methodical precision, the expert authenticated the recording that had prompted Stern's withdrawal, confirming it had not been altered or manipulated. More damaging was the expert's analysis of the server containing surveillance footage from Diddy's properties. The organization of the files, the access logs, and the accompanying notes all corroborated Wright's testimony about how the material was collected and used. Throughout this testimony, Diddy became increasingly agitated, repeatedly whispering to his attorneys and sending urgent text messages during breaks. The control he had maintained for decades was unraveling in real time, exposed through his own recorded words and the electronic trail of the system he had created. During the afternoon break, a commotion outside the courtroom signaled another shocking development. Howard Stern, Diddy's former attorney, had arrived with his own legal counsel. When court resumed, the prosecutor made an unexpected announcement. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Howard Stern as our next witness." Bennett immediately objected. "Your Honor, Mr. Stern was my client's attorney. Any testimony would potentially violate attorney-client privilege." The judge called both attorneys to the bench for a sidebar discussion. After intense legal arguments, she made her ruling. The court recognizes the sanctity of attorney-client privilege. However, The crime fraud exception applies when communications with an attorney are made with the intention of committing or covering up a crime. Based on evidence already presented, the court finds sufficient basis to apply this exception. In limited scope, she turned to Stern. Mr. Stern, you may testify about the specific reasons for your withdrawal as counsel, limited to facts not protected by privilege, and any factual misrepresentations made to you that you later discovered were false. Stern took the stand, his normally commanding presence subdued but resolute. He explained that his withdrawal came after hearing the recording and realizing his client had deliberately misled him about fundamental aspects of the case. As an officer of the court, I have an ethical obligation not to present evidence or make arguments I know to be false, Stern testified. The recording revealed that certain specific denials Mr. Combs had made to me about his knowledge and involvement were untrue. This placed me in an untenable ethical position. While careful to avoid disclosing privileged communications, Stern's testimony made clear that Diddy had systematically lied to his own defense team, creating a defense strategy built on falsehoods. Stern's presence in the courtroom, the respected attorney essentially testifying against his former client, seemed to finally break Diddy's facade completely. The music mogul who had built an empire on projecting strength and control now sat slumped at the defense table, the full weight of his exposed actions visible in his posture and expression. As testimony concluded for the day, the impact of what had unfolded was clear to everyone in the courtroom. What had begun with an attorney's dramatic withdrawal had escalated into the complete exposure of a sophisticated system of control, intimidation, and manipulation, all documented in Diddy's own words and meticulously maintained records, and the man who had once seemed untouchable now appeared utterly defeated, abandoned even by the high-powered attorney he had counted on to protect him. The day after Stern's testimony, the courthouse was surrounded by media and spectators in unprecedented numbers. The story had exploded overnight, with legal experts calling the developments extraordinary and possibly career-ending for Diddy. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The prosecution team moved with renewed confidence, while Diddy's new defense attorneys appeared increasingly burdened by the task before them. Diddy himself, once commanding and charismatic even in the defendant's seat, now looked diminished. The carefully constructed image of power and control shattered beyond repair. As proceedings began, Bennett made a surprise announcement. "Your Honor, my client wishes to address the court regarding a change in our position." The judge's eyebrows raised slightly. "Proceed, Counselor." Bennett took a deep breath. "After extensive consultation with my client, we wish to inform the ID court that Mr. Combs intends to change his plea." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Journalists frantically typed on their phones as Bennett continued. "Mr. Combs wishes to enter a guilty plea to counts 1 through 15 of the indictment, pursuant to a plea agreement that has been negotiated with the prosecution." The judge turned to Diddy. "Mr. Combs, is this your decision? Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you waive your right to continue with this trial and to appeal certain issues?" Diddy stood, his voice barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand." What followed was a detailed recitation of the plea agreement. In exchange for guilty pleas to charges including racketeering, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice, certain other charges would be dismissed. The agreement included a recommended sentence of 15 to 20 years in federal prison, forfeiture of certain assets, and cooperation with ongoing investigations into other industry figures. As the terms were read aloud, the magnitude of the fall became clear. The music mogul who had built an empire worth hundreds of millions would now lose his freedom, his fortune, and the carefully crafted legacy he had built over decades. The judge addressed Diddy directly. "Mr. Combs, before I accept your plea, I need to ensure you are entering it knowingly and voluntarily. Has anyone threatened or coerced you into making this decision?" "No, Your Honor," Diddy replied. "Are you pleading guilty because you are, in fact, guilty of these offenses?" A long pause followed. The courtroom held its collective breath. Finally, Diddy spoke. "Yes, Your Honor. I am guilty." The judge nodded. "The court accepts you're guilty. Pleas to counts 1 through 15. Sentencing will be scheduled for 90 days from today, pending completion of a pre-sentence investigation report." As Diddy was led away by court officers, now in custody rather than free on bail, the impact of his admission of guilt sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry and beyond. Outside the courthouse, victims and former associates who had lived in fear of the system gathered, many openly weeping at the validation of what they had experienced but could never prove. For them, Diddy's guilty plea represented not just the fall of one powerful man, but the beginning of a reckoning for an industry that had enabled and protected him for decades. Industry executives called emergency meetings. Artists who had once been signed to Diddy's labels issued statements distancing themselves from their former mentor. Streaming platforms quietly began removing his music from featured playlists. The most significant fallout, however, came from the cooperation agreement. In exchange for the possibility of a slightly reduced sentence, Diddy had agreed to provide information about others in the industry who had participated in similar practices or benefited from the system he had created. This sent panic through certain circles of the entertainment world. Who would be implicated? How far would the investigation expand? The questions hung in the air like storm clouds, promising more revelations to come. Howard Stern, the attorney whose dramatic withdrawal had triggered the collapse of Diddy's defense, held a brief press conference where he addressed his decision in carefully measured terms. "As attorneys, we have dual obligations to zealously represent our clients and to uphold the integrity of the justice system," Stern stated. "When those obligations come into irreconcilable conflict, we must follow our ethical duties, no matter how difficult that choice may be." Legal experts appeared on news programs explaining the significance of what had occurred. "What we witnessed wasn't just the fall of a powerful defendant," one former prosecutor explained. "It was a rare moment when the system of privilege and protection that often insulates the wealthy and connected from consequences finally gave way to accountability." In the days that followed, the recording that had prompted Stern's withdrawal was played for the first time in open court during a hearing related to the plea. Its contents, now part of the public record, revealed not just Diddy's criminality, but his utter contempt for the legal system he believed he could manipulate. "Lawyers only know what we tell them," his voice had said on the recording. "The rest is just a game. You have enough money, enough connections, enough leverage on the right people. You can make anything go away." The irony was lost on no one. It was precisely his confidence in his ability to control the system that had led to his downfall. The recording he never knew was being made became the evidence that not even the best legal representation could overcome. Perhaps most poignant were the statements from artists who had once been under Diddy's control. Many described the freedom they now felt to speak their truth after years of silence enforced through fear and intimidation. "It was like living with a collar around your neck," one former artist explained. "You could have hit songs, sell millions of records, be adored by fans, but you never felt free. There was always the knowledge that he had something on you, that stepping out of line would mean the end of everything you'd worked for. Today, that collar is finally gone." Industry reforms began almost immediately. Major labels announced new, oversight protocols for recording sessions and artist interactions. Independent support systems were established for artists facing pressure or intimidation. The secrecy that had protected predatory practices for decades began to crack under new scrutiny. As Diddy awaited sentencing in federal custody, his requests for bail pending sentencing denied due to flight risk. The empire he had built continued to crumble. Companies severed licensing agreements. Awards were rescinded. The name that had once opened every door in the industry became toxic overnight. Yet amid the spectacular fall, there emerged something unexpected. Hope. Hope that an industry long plagued by exploitation and abuse might finally face a moment of genuine reckoning and reform. Hope that other victims, seeing accountability at last, might find the courage to speak their own truths. For those who had suffered under the system, the image of Diddy being led away in handcuffs represented something they had never thought possible. Proof that even the most powerful, connected, and protected figures could eventually face justice. The attorney who had walked away rather than continue to represent a client who had lied to him. The security chief who had finally found the courage to expose what he had witnessed. The young artists who had come forward, despite their fear. Together, they had accomplished what once seemed impossible. They had brought down a man who had believed himself untouchable. As one legal commentator observed, the lesson here isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about what happens when people who have been silenced finally find their voices. It's about what becomes possible when those with conscience decide that truth matters more than power or money or fame. In the end, it wasn't just Diddy who had been on trial. It was a system of power, privilege, and intimidation that had allowed abuses to continue unchecked for decades. And while one guilty plea couldn't undo years of damage, it represented something that many victims had long stopped believing in: the possibility of justice. If you found this story compelling and want to stay updated on the continuing fallout from this historic case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. As more information emerges about who else might be implicated in the ongoing investigation, we'll bring you the latest developments and expert analysis. The music industry may never be the same after these revelations, and we'll be here to document every step of this continuing story of accountability and change.